Today being the third Sunday of Advent, it is the Sunday of joy, where our theme, you probably noticed it in our songs, in our prayer, and now in our sermon, the theme of the day is joy. And joy is certainly something that we attach to Christmas and Christmas season. There is a lot of joy. It's something that you see everywhere you go. Oftentimes there will be ornaments placed up that just simply say joy in it. And to be honest, it's a great season to have joy, but you also know that if things aren't going right for you, if there's struggle in your life, if there's loss in your life, if you're overwhelmed with grief, there's nothing you want less than to be around joy. When life isn't going great, joy can feel so offensive and overwhelming, and you can find yourself pretty quickly deciding that you want to be the Ebenezer Scrooge in someone else's story. It could be that you have grief. There could be recent loss in your life, whether that be death or a job or a move. You can have grief, and that can cause you not to want to have joy. You could just be feeling the overwhelming busyness of the season. You can be struggling with the fact that there's always another Christmas play that you have to be at, or party, or events. And it's not too long before it feels like every night of the week you have another Christmas place to be. Sometimes 2 or 3 commitments on the same night. And the busyness can become so overwhelming that you become tired. And when you're tired, you struggle with joy. You just want to rest. You could be weary of the state of the world. You might be a news watcher or a Twitter follower. You may just be constantly engaged with all that is wrong with the world. There's war everywhere. There's poverty everywhere. There's political disagreement everywhere. Like if you think our climate is contentious in America, just look at a couple of other countries halfway across the world, right? And once you start looking at those, then you start thinking, you don't think, oh, we've got it so great here, I should have some joy. You start thinking, the world's a mess, it's on fire. It's hard to have joy when you have these sort of feelings, these sort of emotions, these sort of struggles. And so I wanted to start today by redefining joy, thinking about what joy is. And so if you've been with me for a while, you know that I love a website called The Bible Project. They break down all sorts of biblical, theological, scriptural contexts. And I brought a video today where they talk about the use of the word joy in Scripture and what that might mean to a Christian people. And I hope that it's overwhelming in a way that brings some new context to you, so that you're not just thinking joy in terms of sadness or happiness, but there's something much more going on in a scriptural context. So watch this video on the concept of joy.
Being in a good mood is really great, and most languages have lots of words to describe the experience, like happy, cheerful, joyful, and so on. The same goes for the languages of the Bible. In ancient biblical Hebrew, there's a variety of words, like simcha, sason, or gil. In the Greek New Testament, there's kara, euphrosune, or agaliasis. Each word has its own unique nuance, but they all basically refer to the feeling of joy and happiness. Now, what makes these biblical joy words interesting is noticing the kinds of things that bring happiness, and also seeing how joy is a key theme that runs through the whole story of the Bible. Let's start with sources of joy. On page 1 of the Bible, God says that this world is very good. And so naturally, people find joy in beautiful and good things of life, like growing flocks or an abundant harvest on the hills. The poet of Psalm 104 says, a good bottle of wine is God's gift to bring joy to people's hearts. People find joy at a wedding or in their children. There's even a Hebrew proverb that compares the joy that perfume brings to your nose with the joy a good friend brings to your heart. However, human history isn't just a joy fest. The biblical story shows how we live in a world that's been corrupted by our own selfishness. It's marked by death and loss. And this is where biblical faith offers a unique perspective on joy. It's an attitude God's people adopt, not because of happy circumstances, but because of their hope in God's love and promise. So when the Israelites were suffering from slavery in Egypt, God raised up Moses to lead them into freedom. And the first thing the Israelites did was sing for joy. Even though they were in the middle of a desert, they were vulnerable, the promised land was still far away, they rejoiced anyway. Later biblical poets looked back on this story and they remembered how the Lord caused his people to leave with joy, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. This joy in the wilderness, this was a defining moment, a way of saying that the joy of God's people is not determined by their struggles, but by their future destiny. This theme appears later in Israel's story, when Israel suffered under the oppression of foreign empires. The prophet Isaiah looked for a day when God would raise up a new deliverer like Moses. That's when those redeemed by the Lord will return to Zion with glad shouts, with eternal joy crowning their heads. Happiness and joy will overtake them. And while the Israelites waited, they chose joy to anticipate their future redemption. This is why it's significant that when Jesus of Nazareth was born, it was announced as good news that brings great joy. We're told that Jesus himself rejoiced and gave thanks to God his Father when he began to announce the kingdom of God. He even taught his followers the same joy in the wilderness, saying, when people reject you or persecute you for following me, rejoice, be very glad, because your reward is great in heaven. After his death and resurrection, Jesus commissioned his followers to go out and announce the good news that he was the risen King of the world. And as they did so, the early Christian communities were known for being full of joy, even when they were persecuted. Like when the Apostle Paul was sitting in a dirty Roman prison, he could say that he's chosen joy, even if he gets executed. He called this the joy of faith, or joy in the Lord. He believed it was the gift of God's Spirit, a sign that Jesus' presence is with you, inspiring hope in the midst of hardship. And when you believe that Jesus' love has overcome death itself, joy becomes reasonable in the darkest of circumstances. Now, this doesn't mean that you ignore or suppress your sorrow. That's not healthy or necessary. Paul often expressed his grief about missing loved ones or losing friends or his own freedom. He called it being full of sorrow and yet rejoicing. As he acknowledged his pain, he also made a choice to trust Jesus, that his loss wouldn't be the final word. This is very different from the trite advice to turn that frown upside down. Christian joy is a profound decision of faith and hope in the power of Jesus' own life and love. And that's what biblical joy is all about.
So you see, in just a few minutes, it was a run through the Bible from the beginning stories all the way to the very end stories, that the theme of joy emerges over and over and over. And it often, in the stories, springs up out of difficult seasons. It often shows up when we're struggling or we're not at our best. And the reason for joy, the foundation of it, is that God gives us promises that everything will be made okay. That we can live in joy of a future redemption that isn't fully experienced yet, but we know that God is doing and has done what he promised. And so we've been reading through texts in Isaiah this month, looking at these promises of the Old Testament that come fulfilled or true in Jesus in the future, and finding hints of God's work in our world, answering promises, gives us hope that God will win final victories as well. And so today we're going to look at the book of Isaiah again, this time in chapter 11. And again, read a text that if you've been around the church or to Christmas services or Advent services, might be very familiar to you. If not, I hope you'll engage and hear it with fresh ears for the first time. Would you stand with me, though, as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today? Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Starting with verse 1, it says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So let's give some context for what's happening here. In the chapter right before this, Isaiah is speaking about the downfall of Assyria. I've got a map here just to show you a little bit of this ancient world. Where the green and red lines meet in the left, the town of Samaria, that is the area in which this is being written. That's where Jerusalem is, where Israel is. But Assyria is this foreign empire, the strongest nation in the entire world. And as you can see, they're beginning to encroach into Israel. And Isaiah is speaking in this context. You may remember 2 weeks ago, we talked very explicitly about Isaiah warning an evil king not to get in bed with the Assyrians. And he wants to because he loves their power. Well, eventually, Isaiah says, this is going to be your downfall. The kingdoms are going to fall. There's going to be an incoming of this. And they're going to take some of our people away and send some of their people here. And then there will be real trouble. But in spite of that prophecy, Isaiah says, be faithful because they're not going to win. They are going to lose. They will experience their own downfall. And so this is the context in chapter 10 of Isaiah in which what we've just read emerges. Isaiah is saying they're going to come and cause problems, but God is going to take them out. And it is fascinating. If you look at this map, I don't know how well you can read it from where you're seated. I don't know how well your eyes still are. But it is interesting to notice that, Jerusalem still exists, but Assyria is not really a thing anymore, right? And so the powerful are the Assyrians, but they get so overwhelmingly undercut by history. And Jerusalem, the powerless people who think they may have to side up with Assyria in order to have any influence, that city still remains, still has influence in our world. And so God does undercut the Assyrians, just as Isaiah promises that he will. And so we're being given this imagination by Isaiah what it might look like when the Assyrians no longer have power. Because when we can imagine beyond the circumstance of where we are right now, we might just behave differently if we can see past the trouble of today. And so Isaiah paints this picture. He says there's a stump. A stump. Have you ever had a stump in your backyard before? Those things are ugly. They're in the way. They seem to be no good. You may start pricing out how much it'll cost to get rid of this stump. You realize that somebody needs to come in and bore in and take roots out. And then you start thinking, well, maybe I don't want to pay that much money. And so it just sits there all ugly. Stump. Stump is worthless. And Isaiah is saying, out of something as worthless as a stump, something as depressing, something as in the way, something that may represent a once grandeur but now useless, will emerge a shoot. This is a picture of what a shoot emerging out of a stump might look like. You see, the stump looks dead. But that little plant emerging out of once was a great tree looks very much alive. And Isaiah is saying, like that shoot will come from the line of Jesse. And if you were a Jewish person listening to this, your ears would perk up. Jesse was the father of King David. King David was the best king we ever had. That was the glory days. That's when things were good. That's what we want to get back to. If only we could have those circumstances, then today would be okay. But instead, all we have is a stump. That's what living here is like now, being a stump. Used to be glorious, is now just in the way and worthless. But Isaiah is saying a shoot from the family of Jesse will emerge. And we know that Jesus himself comes from the family of Jesse. There are genealogies in the New Testament showing how Jesus shows up in this line of Jesse. And this is, of course, a messianic overtone in this text, meaning that we should hear a promise of a coming Messiah that Jesus will one day be. But there's more than just the shoot that will come up from Jesse. There's other words and languages from the New Testament that describe Jesus that are borrowing from this text to show us that the promise of a future Messiah has come in Jesus. Verse 2 says, the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. At Jesus' baptism, we see that happen. In verses 3 and 4, we're told, he will not judge with eyes and ears, but with justice he will give decisions for the poor. There's so many times when we read the stories of Jesus that we're ready with our own imaginations and preconceived notions that we know what Jesus is going to say, and then he doesn't say what we expect him to say. There's so many times that he shows up in neighborhoods across the tracks that all of the powerful people and the good priests of the day have forgotten. And Jesus shows up and he feeds them and cares for them and loves them and gives them attention that the powerful people of Jerusalem are no longer giving them. Jesus fills this vocation. And then we're also given vivid descriptions of the upside-down kingdom of peace that the Messiah will bring. And those, if you're paying attention, are troubling. And if you're not troubled by them, I'm going to show you some pictures just to make sure you get a little troubled. Okay? It's not very easy, I will admit. Most times I want to go looking for a picture on Google. It is very easy for me to find exactly what I'm looking for to put up here. But these descriptions of how it will be one day when God makes all things right are so opposite of our everyday world that it was very, very difficult to find anything that was usable. But let's check out these pictures of what we're told one day it will look like. A wolf will lie with a lamb. You can tell that's a drawing because there's no way that's happening, right? Wolves eat lambs. Why are there shepherds? Because lambs need protecting from wolves. And we're being told that one day the Messiah is going to come and change everything, is going to make things right in our world. It will be so right in our world that the best predators will no longer want to eat their prey. Now think about how upside down and different that is than the world we live in. The wolves will lie down with the lambs. And then we're given another one. Leopards will lie down with kids, the little baby goats. I've never seen this scene at the zoo before. I like the zoo. I go to the zoo. I love the big cats. The big cats are my favorite at the zoo. I love seeing them. They walk back and forth, always looking like they're ready for a fight. They're big and burly, but they're also like fluffy and cute. Oh, I love the cats so much. The goats are way on the other side of the zoo. You can go in and pet the goats at the zoo. They're not letting you within 200 feet of the leopard. And yes, when God comes and makes things right, it will be so backwards from what we experience that the goats will become a snuggly pillow for the vicious leopard. We're told that bear and cows will feed with one another. Again, have you ever seen a bear just let into a nice cow pasture at a cow petting farm that you get to go to? Bears are not allowed near the cows. This is so very different than our everyday experience. And the next one I'm going to show you is the one that's going to bother you the most. The kids will put their hands in vipers' nests. Now imagine you walk into this scene with your little baby. Your little baby is taking a nap on your bed, and you come in, and a snake has made its way onto the bed. My guess is you're freaking out. I know, Pastor Brian's our executive pastor. He would probably just let that baby get eaten. He loves his kids. He loves kids, but he hates snakes. But just imagine, like, the kids no longer will even need to be worried because the snakes aren't going to bite. They could be friends with each other. They could reach their hand into the nest. They can snuggle up near them because there is no more danger. The world has been made so utterly right that the things that are logical and common sense to us, the places and times in which we need to step back and really assess the situation no longer bring danger anymore. This is how upside down the kingdom of God is going to be when it comes in fullness. We are going to get to the day that the things that bother us and scare us, the things that we know are dangerous, the things that we know can harm us, the things we know that we need to be paying very close attention to and be on high alert for, will no longer cause us harm. Now, we can talk all we want about snakes and bears and leopards and all of this kind of stuff, but really, honestly, those aren't your day-to-day harms. I wish for you that you don't see a snake for at least a few months. But other things are going to feel as harmful as the snake. There's going to be things that sap your attention and peel your joy away from you. There's going to be metaphorical snakes. They can come surprisingly in the way of death and grief. They can come in the way of a coworker who seems to bite as firmly as snakes bite. It could feel as though it's family and tension and broken relationship, things that should and could be right but just aren't. The snakes and the leopards are there in our life. We experience them, and so often they can pull so tightly on us, squeeze us so firmly that joy just drips out of us. But there's such good news in this text that we're reading, because unlike so many biblical texts that we read that call us to something, that invite us to do something, that ask us to live on a higher plane or to do something better, this one doesn't do any of that at all. These verses are not at all about getting it right. They're not at all about trying harder. They're not even a little bit about doing better. These are all texts about what God is going to do for us. God sees that our world is upside down and difficult. He sees predators. He sees things are not made right. And through the word of Isaiah, he is saying that one day the Messiah will come and will accomplish the undoing of all of the harm in this world. All of the things that sap our joy, all of the things that threaten us, all of the things that bring danger, all of the things that unsettle us, all of the things that cause us on a day-to-day basis to say, things are not right in this world, things are not right in my life, things are not right in my family, things are not right at my job, all of those things that you could talk about that eat at you little by little, all of those little injustices, all of the big injustices, God sees that the world is not right. God sees that your world is not right, and it's not fair. And so God is promising through Isaiah here that a shoot will emerge from the stump, from the line of Jesse, and it will make all things right. Now, the promise is kept in Jesus. We get moments and foretastes that God is accomplishing what he promises. Sometimes we may say, why can't you just finish it? Why can't you just let us experience that viperless experience? Why do you let leopards prowl around me? We're given promises that the victory is won, and we experience at times, and we wait, sometimes with difficulty, for it to be experienced in its fullness. But I want you to know that God has won the victory in Jesus, and we will experience it in fullness one day. It reminds me of some of the World War II stories after the war is over. Have you heard any of these stories before? About how it wasn't an internet society, and so communication was difficult, especially in some of the places where war broke out that was a little outside of the main battles. There's a story of a man named Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese warrior who was in the Philippines, who had with him 3 people under his command, 4 people in his command, and they were trapped inside of the Philippines, and the war ended. But the information didn't get to them. So the Philippine armies, who were tired of having this small band of guerrillas in their neighborhood, started printing all of these pieces of paper and airdropping them into their little fort inside of their Philippine world. They said, the war is over. Look at all these pictures. Look at all these newspaper articles. They're just giving them information after information, trying to prove to them that the war is over, that peace has been accomplished. And do you know what those 4 Japanese soldiers trapped inside of the Philippines thought? These guys are lying to me. They just want us to stop fighting. They're trying to get us to surrender by any means necessary. And so they keep fighting until one of the 4 Japanese escapes and gets out, and they think, well, he is a traitor. And then another one of them gets shot, and with no medical among them, they nurse this guy back to health until he's shot again, and finally he goes out of there. Hiroo, 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 fought into the 1950s with 3 other men, but after all 3 of them deserted him or died, he stayed and kept fighting. For 29 years, he fought as a lone guerrilla inside of the Philippines after the war was over. Can you imagine what a nuisance he was to that town that he was trapped inside of? Can you imagine how annoying it must have been to have one rogue soldier still fighting 29 years later? And they kept sending him information about a world that's moving on. And he kept thinking, they're just trying to fight a psychological battle with me. And finally, he demanded that he would not surrender until his literal commander came and told him the war was over, which they finally arranged after 29 years. Now, you just do the math here. From 1945 to 1974, what happens in that world? Think of all of the things that he has missed in all of these years before he finally gets his commander, Age, to come and tell him, dude, the war has been over for 30 years. To me, that's kind of the situation that we're living in now. We're awaiting a full culmination, but it sure feels like the battle is raging still. Still feels like the vipers are nipping at our heels. Sure feels like the leopards are prowling around us. It sure feels like it's not safe to let the bears in with the cows. But in Jesus, the shoot of Jesse that's been born into our world that we await on Christmas, that we celebrate his life and ministry and look upon his cross and see him die a sacrificial death for us, buried, and then raises again in 3 days. We need nothing more than that to tell us that the battle's over. But we live in a world where there's still these stray guerrillas who haven't gotten the message. And among those stray guerrillas is the devil himself, who uses death and lies against us, that we might continue to struggle and hurt. And in our struggle and hurt, we have a hard time exuding joy when this life can be difficult. And so the question I want to ask you today and invite you into is, can I have joy even when my circumstances aren't great? Even when I've got names and faces on the vipers that I refuse to put my hand into their nest? Can I have joy when there's such real trial and struggle in our world and in my life in particular? Can I still have joy? And my hope is that what you can see today as we end this out, is that in all of these different biblical circumstances, that we're given this Isaiah image that this is the future. that when you look upon the things that are dangerous, that bring grief, that cause hurt in your life, not to say that that's not real, but be able to look it in the face and say, you're not going to win. And if our enemies, which are real, sorrow, death, infighting within families, this is all real. Don't pretend like it doesn't exist. But imagine how much joyful you can be when you can look your trials in the face and say, you're a tough opponent, but you've lost. Imagine the sort of joy you can have when the trials and struggles around you know aren't going to be victorious. Because one day Jesus is going to turn it all upside down. And what will be left is joy. So as we head into this final stretch into Christmas season, a time where we're told over and over and over to have joy, and sometimes it's not easy. Do the work. Take the time to look the circumstances dead in the face and see it through the lens of the victory of Jesus Christ. And see if the promise of Jesus can't turn what feels like losses into victories in your life. And so we're going to sing a final song, as we do when we worship with one another. And I want to invite you to pray as well as sing. If you can name in particular that which is stealing your joy right now, it would be a great time to come and take a moment before we leave the presence of God here in this worship service, to come and to kneel and to pray and to think and to struggle with that which is stealing your joy. And think about it through the lens of Jesus. And see that the joy stealers of this world, that which is dangerous, has lost. It's just fighting a losing battle. And see if God can't overwhelm your struggle with joy. Would you stand with me as we close out this service?